Here. I saw him earlier. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. The short history of DNA databanks shows that the executive branch has continued to push for expansion of who goes into the databank. At the same time that the executive branch has been pushing for a relentless expansion of the database, the legislative branch has also balanced that expansion with careful regulation and oversight over the retention of DNA as well as the distribution of DNA through protections and safeguards that have been placed in the Maryland DNA Collection Act. Now we find out that there has been the creation of shadow databases, something that I don't think was ever anticipated when the executive branch was here requesting expansion of the DNA database. And these shadow DNA databases are wholly unregulated by the Maryland DNA Collection Act. There's no restrictions on who goes into those DNA databases. There's no restrictions on how those DNA samples are used. There's no restrictions on how those DNA samples are shared. So, for example, crime victim DNA, suspect DNA, DNA even from people who have had their DNA collected surreptitiously by the police and don't even know it's been taken. None of that is regulated. And as I lay out in my written testimony, there's a vast potential for misuse of DNA. Essentially, what I'm seeing is that the executive branch is okay with protections on the collection, retention, and distribution of convictees or arrestees' DNA, but they're not okay with restrictions on use, retention, or distribution of DNA from victims of crime, from people whose DNA has been collected even though they haven't been arrested or convicted. And that's a very upside-down world. What I'm opposed to is the indefinite retention and the unrestricted collection of DNA from people such as victims of crime, whether they're deceased or not, because once it's in that local DNA data bank, there's no requirement for how long it can be there. There's no requirement or restriction on how it can be used. So, for example, a crime victim of homicide's DNA goes into a local DNA data bank. The ban on familial searching that applies to the Maryland State DNA database does not apply to the local DNA database. So what you can have is a victim of a homicide whose DNA is then used to investigate and target living family members. And that's the power of DNA, and that's its potential for misuse. And that's why the legislature has carefully put into place oversight and safeguards regarding the retention and regarding the distribution and regarding the use of DNA once it's been collected. All we're simply saying is that the same restrictions that apply to convictee and arrestees should apply to these local DNA databases. What we're seeing, both here in Maryland and across the country, is a trend for local police agencies to try to escape the regulation and the restrictions of the CODIS system and the state DNA database by opening up their own local DNA databanks and then pooling their data with other localities. And now all of a sudden, all of the careful restrictions that have been put into place to safeguard against the misuse of DNA have been evaded.
People, let's say at the hospital, if they don't know what the circumstances are that the person was injured, or let's say they had an accident or something like that, if a person walks into the hospital and says, I've been shot, do they collect their DNA?
Well, they can certainly collect tissue samples and clothing that may contain biological material, yes.
But, okay, to your knowledge, do they run this, do they place this DNA in the shadow accounts?
Yes, in fact, there's a reported decision from Judge Titus of the United States District Court in which that precise situation occurred, where an individual who's a victim of a crime was a patient in the hospital, his bloody pants were collected, and then later the police who were in possession of those pants developed a DNA profile from it and then put that DNA profile into their local DNA databank. So today's crime victim becomes tomorrow's suspect. And it's precisely those types of situations that need to be subjected to the careful oversight and regulatory process that the legislative branch has put into place to safeguard against the misuse of DNA when the executive branch is continually and relentlessly pushing for expansion of these DNA databases. Because at least with your trash, it's a voluntary act. You can shred your documents if you want to. With your DNA, it's involuntarily shed. You leave it behind. And, you shed millions of skin cells every day. And so it's a very easy thing for police to collect your DNA without you even knowing it and to put that DNA into a law enforcement database to investigate you for crime. What we're simply saying is that the proliferation of these local DNA databases evade the protections that this legislature put into place to balance the executive branch's expansion of DNA databases, and local police agencies shouldn't be allowed to so easily evade those protections by simply setting up shop on the local basis for law enforcement investigatory purposes and only restricting the use to their own local policies that have no oversight and no regulation.
Thank you.
The legislature knows what's in the statewide DNA database because it requires the state police to report on what's there and who it's collected from.
Right.
There's no reporting requirements for local DNA databanks, short of these Public Information Act documents that we obtained with the assistance of the David A. Clark School of Law. Short of those documents and short of information that was provided to the Baltimore Sun in its recent story, you really have no idea what they're doing with these local DNA databanks. And so there's a huge incentive, and we're seeing as the cost of DNA collection testing comes down, and as the ease with which it can be collected goes up, local databanks, not only in Maryland but across the country, are proliferating.
Right.
And they're doing it precisely because they're not subject to regulatory oversight and restriction.
Okay.
It's a free-fall.
Thank you.
Honorable Chairman Valerio, distinguished members of the Judiciary Committee, I'm Dr. Marvin Cheatham, Political Action Chair and lobbyist for the Maryland State Conference of NAACP branches. We support House Bill 1523. Very impressive. I want to share with you very briefly a testimony in part that was given by the ACLU back in 2008, and it was entitled DNA Presumption of Innocence and Racial Profiling. And we quote very briefly the following. The existence of DNA database turns the presumption of innocence on its head by rendering every person in the database as a suspect for all future crimes, subjecting those who have not been convicted of a crime to database inclusion on the past bills. We contend this subverts the presumption of innocence. Such subversion is characteristic of an authoritarian regime and not a free and autonomous democracy. The Maryland State Conference of NAACP agrees not only with this testimony that was given by the ACLU, but we strongly support this bill and hope this body would give it a favorable recommendation.